Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Media Rants. I am Tony Palmeri. Today's rant is called the Electoral College History, Cons, and Pros. I'm recording on July 24th, so we're about 100 days away from the presidential election, which means that this thing called the Electoral College is once again in play. The Electoral College is one of many things that the mainstream media does not explain very well, so I'm going to take a stab at it today in this video. Many people are confused why Hillary Clinton, who received 3 million more popular votes than Donald Trump in 2016, why is she not president today? Well, because Mr. Trump received more electoral votes. And we'll explain that today. The 2016 election was not the only time that's happened. It's happened 4 previous times, and we'll talk a little bit about each of those later on. If you look at this map on our first slide, Politico.com is keeping a running tally of the electoral map. And so they say if the election were held today, late July, these dark blue states represent the states that are almost certainly going to go Democratic. So Mr. Biden, the Democratic nominee, starts off with about 183 electoral votes. You need 270 to be president. President Trump, the dark red states are almost certainly going to go for him. He starts off with 77 electoral votes. Then other states have various shades of blue. They're leaning Democratic. If you add all those up, Mr. Biden would be at 278 electoral votes. He'd be president. But again, there's no guarantee he gets those states that are leaning blue at this moment. President Trump, if the election were held today, is at about 169 electoral votes when you take into account the ones that are definitely going red and those that are leaning red. There's quite a few green states this year. Greens are the toss-ups. Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and a couple of others are toss-ups. Anyone can get them. Now, the main point here is in 2020, as with any election cycle, we could get another situation where one candidate wins the popular vote but loses the electoral vote. Why does that happen? Should it happen? What can be done about it? Let's give some history of this, and then we'll have some of the con side of the Electoral College. But then I think there are some pro arguments for it too that we'll get to. Why don't we start off with just a brief history of the Electoral College. In 1787, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, they didn't have majority support for electing the president by popular vote. I mean, especially the southern states were afraid that they would lose slavery if the president were elected by popular vote. They also didn't have majority support for letting the Congress choose the president. That would be more of like a parliamentary type of system. So those two competing proposals did not have majority support. So the Electoral College was a kind of compromise. It was proposed by James Wilson of Pennsylvania and James Madison of Virginia. James Wilson owned one slave and James Madison owned many slaves. That'll become important in a little bit here, as we'll see. The electoral system is described in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution and the 12th Amendment. You can Google that and read the actual language. The number of electors for each state is based on its congressional representation. So, for example, I live in Wisconsin. We have 8 members of the House of Representatives. We have 2 United States senators, and so that gives us 10 electoral votes. California has 53 members of the House of Representatives and 2 United States senators, and so they have 55 electoral votes. 48 out of the 50 states require that the electors all go to whoever wins the popular vote in the state. So for example, if Mr. Biden wins Wisconsin, he will get all 10 of Wisconsin's electoral votes. I believe only Nebraska and Maine do it differently. They divide the electors by congressional district. So if a candidate wins a certain congressional district, he or she gets the elector of that district. And if another candidate wins a different district, that candidate gets the elector in that district. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Now, for 32 of the first 36 years of the Constitution, the presidency was held by a slave-owning Virginian. And so there are some historians and pundits and writers who do believe that the Electoral College was designed mostly to protect the institution of slavery. Today you hear a lot of rhetoric of, oh no, it's all about giving smaller states a voice and so on. Maybe there's some of that, but I think a really good argument can be made that the essence of the electoral system from the beginning was to protect the slave-holding states, which it did very powerfully for 32 of the first 36 years. Today, the Electoral College consists of 538 electors. A majority of 270 electoral votes is required to elect the president. Let's talk about 4 elections before 2016 where the candidate who lost the popular vote still became the president. 2016 was uniquely awful in many ways, and that's why later on I'm going to devote an entire slide just to the 2016 election. So in the year 2000, most of you remember that, George W. Bush became our president, yet Al Gore received more popular votes. Thanks to the Supreme Court, I'm not going to get into all the political wrangling, George W. Bush ended up with just over 270 electoral votes, and so he became the president. In 1888, Benjamin Harrison became our president, even though Grover Cleveland actually got more popular votes. However, Harrison, at that time, he didn't need 270, it was lower population. Harrison ended up with the majority of electoral votes. In 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes became our president, even though Samuel Tilden did better with popular votes. However, Hayes got just enough of the electoral votes that he needed at that time to become the president. 1824 was a crazy year. John Quincy Adams became our president. Now this was interesting. Andrew Jackson on election day got more popular votes, but Jackson was also ahead in the Electoral College on election day. However, and we'll phrase it here, Jackson won the popular vote and had more electoral votes than Adams, but with 2 other candidates in the race, Jackson did not receive an Electoral College majority. The election went into the House of Representatives, which voted to give the presidency to Adams. That was called the corrupt bargain election. Andrew Jackson came back 4 years later and did win the presidency, and then he ended up winning a second term also. So these were the 4 presidential elections before 2016 in which the candidate who lost the popular vote still became our president. Now let's get into some of the cons and pros of the Electoral College. I want to start off by what political scientists will tell us when it comes to voting expectations. We all expect when we go to vote that my vote as an individual has no more or less weight than any other voter. So in this picture, you've got former President Obama voting. His vote, along with any other former or current elected official, his vote has no more weight than anyone else's. We expect that. We also expect that my vote is cast for the candidate for whom I voted. And we expect that the candidate who gets the most votes will win the election. Well, all 3 of these voting expectations are violated in the Electoral College, as we will see. And so the first con of the Electoral College is that all votes in the Electoral College are not equal. The Electoral College gives much more power to votes in the so-called battleground states. A battleground state is a state in which the winner generally wins by 5% of the vote or less. And so in 2016, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania became the critical battleground states. In fact, for the last, I don't know, 20, 30, maybe 40 years, most of the campaign activity only takes place in about 5 or 6 states, the so-called battleground states. The Electoral College does give much more power to voters in those states. And so if you think about it, here's California and New York, these huge population centers that are pretty much ignored during the presidential election. Sparsely populated states have lower voter to elector ratios. For example, Wyoming has about 140,000 eligible voters for every elector. There's Wyoming with its 3 electoral votes. Ohio which has 18 electoral votes. Ohio has about 480,000 eligible voters for every elector. And so it doesn't seem like every voter is equal across the country. That is one of the consequences of the Electoral College system. The second main argument against the Electoral College is that my vote is not necessarily cast for the person for whom I voted. Now, to illustrate this, I want to talk about the presidential election in 2012, especially how it played out in Wisconsin. That year, on the Republican side, we had presidential candidate Mitt Romney. His vice presidential running mate was Paul Ryan, who was a congressman from Wisconsin at that time. And of course, the Democrats were President Barack Obama, who was running for re-election, and his VP candidate, of course, was Joe Biden. So that year in Wisconsin, Barack Obama won the popular vote fairly handily, 1.6 million votes to 1.4 million for Romney, roughly 53 to 46%. However, Mitt Romney actually won 5 of Wisconsin's 8 congressional districts, but Wisconsin, like 48 states in the Union and the District of Columbia, has what's known as a winner-take-all method of allocating the electoral votes. So all of Wisconsin's 10 electoral votes went to Barack Obama and Joe Biden. If Wisconsin's rules were like Maine or Nebraska, Obama and Romney would each have received 5 electoral votes. So you can see how those people who voted in the 5 congressional districts that Romney won would essentially feel as if their presidential vote really didn't count. And the third argument against the Electoral College, and of course this is the one that most people think about, is that the candidate with the most votes may not win the election. If you look at all of these 11 states on the left, all of these states have a winner-take-all method of allocating the electoral vote. A candidate could win just these 11 states and become the president of the United States, because these 11 states add up to a total of 270. So that is a little bit curious. That's never actually happened where someone just won these 11 states. But again, it could happen. And of course, it helps to emphasize the point that a person really could get blown out in the popular vote and yet still win the presidency. Now, it's really easy to hate the Electoral College, correct? I mean, the fact that the person that gets fewer popular votes can become the president, that seems to offend almost everybody. But the first argument in favor of the Electoral College is actually, you know, all voting systems have flaws. There is no such thing as a perfect voting system. So the issue becomes trying to balance the good and the bad in various voting systems. So I just feel it's important to point this out as something in favor of the Electoral College, because we often make it sound like it's the worst voting system ever created, and it's not, because there is not a perfect voting system. It does not exist. The second argument in favor of the Electoral College is that while it is true that the Electoral College allows the possibility that the popular vote winner can lose the election, it's also true that 40 of 45 of our presidents have won the popular vote. So it is relatively rare for someone to win the popular vote and lose the election. I mean, it's happened twice recently, 2000, 2016. So maybe we think it happens a lot more than it actually does, but historically it's relatively rare. And then the third argument in favor of the Electoral College is what I think is the strongest one, which is that the Electoral College prevents fringe candidates from winning the presidency simply by attaining a plurality of popular votes. Let's give a hypothetical here. Suppose Jeb Bush had been the Republican nominee in 2016, and suppose Donald Trump had run as an independent. Hillary Clinton, say, gets 33% of the national popular vote. Jeb Bush gets 33% of the national popular vote, and Donald Trump gets 34% of the national vote. Trump still becomes president, even though 66% voted against him. And what happens is, if we had a national popular vote winner, we'd have probably many, many more than just two major candidates. And there's a strong chance that the fringe candidates who can get 25, 30% of the vote have a much, much stronger chance of becoming president. Really, the only way around that is to mandate that the winner get at least 50% of the vote plus one. I might talk about that shortly here. Now, the year 2016 was a uniquely awful election cycle because in some ways in 2016 we can see the shortcomings of both the popular vote and the Electoral College methods of choosing winners. So let's start with the Republican primaries. That year, in the early primary states in 2016, Donald Trump won with a plurality of popular votes. That is, in the critical months of February and March, when the nominee is really selected, Mr. Trump usually didn't even come close to 50% of the vote in any of the state contests, but there were a lot of candidates, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, John Kasich, and there were others that were splitting up the vote. Mr. Trump, as we can see here, ended up with 44.9% of the popular vote. So the Republican primaries became a good example of why a national popular vote would not or might not work, right? Because you'd get more Donald Trumps, correct? Because he won with less than 50% of the vote. We allow people in this country to win elections on a plurality. You don't need a majority of the votes, you only need a plurality. But then in the general election, which was a total disaster, Mr. Trump ended up with 304 electoral votes. Hillary Clinton ended up with 227. But in the national popular vote, this was quite sizable victory for Clinton, 65.8 million votes, 62.9 for Trump. But by the way, this map is called a cartogram, right? This divides up the vote by population density rather than just geographical area, and so we can see there's a lot more blue than the traditional map shows. In the 37 non-swing states, defined as states in which the winner won by 5% or more, Hillary Clinton had a fairly substantial margin, 49% to 45%, but Mr. Trump won in the swing states, okay? 48% to 46%. The swing states are defined as those states in which the winner wins by 5% of the vote or less. What I find to be critical, I believe in all of those states, or at least most of them, but I think all of them, the winner got less than 50% of the vote. So it's almost impossible to have any mandate to govern when you're winning an election under these conditions. And of course, Mr. Trump has not had a mandate. He's tried to govern as if he did have a mandate, but of course he was not even close to it. So my point here, folks, is 2016 showed really the shortcomings of both the popular vote method and the Electoral College, and some kind of reform is needed. So how do we reform the system? There really are no great answers to this. I think that one possibility at the state level to have runoff voting, so that would mean in each state, whoever wins the election has to win with at least 50% of the vote plus one. So this little visual shows how runoff voting works. In the first round of voting, one candidate has 38% of the vote, another one has 21, another one has 41. So runoff voting essentially requires a second round. The person who finished last in the first round is taken out. We have another vote, and all of a sudden the person that originally had 38 becomes the winner with 52% of the vote. We have the technology now to do this as an instant runoff voting, so that it doesn't have to be two separate election days. Runoff voting at the state levels would not eliminate the possibility of a person still losing the national popular vote and winning the Electoral College. However, just the fact that someone did get at least 50% in each state, I think would go a long way toward increasing confidence in the overall vote. Another reform, and this has been suggested for a long time by the National Popular Vote Compact organization. The National Popular Vote Compact, basically it requires groups of states whose electoral votes add up to at least 270 to say that they will honor the popular vote winner. So if the National Popular Vote Compact had been in place in 2016, Hillary Clinton would be president, because it would mean at least 270 electoral votes in the states would have agreed to go with the popular vote winner. In this graphic, if you can see it, the states in green have already enacted the National Popular Vote Compact. Wisconsin, where I live, has not enacted it yet. I mean, the National Popular Vote Compact would guarantee that the popular vote winner would become the president. However, it would increase the chances again that we would get multiple candidates. We'd split up the popular vote, and there would be a possibility that someone with, say, 35% of the vote could win the presidency, because the compact would have to go along with that winner. I think the National Popular Vote Compact only works really well if you have a kind of runoff where a person has to get 50% of the vote plus one. But remember, we really can't do that. We can't do that at the national level, because the Constitution requires that elections be done at the state level. So, I mean, I think runoffs at the state level, National Popular Vote Compact, they're both good ideas. They don't really solve the problem, but both probably would produce more confidence in the final results than what we have now. I want to thank you so much for listening today. I hope you found this presentation on the Electoral College interesting and useful. You can see more media rants, print versions of them, at tpmediarants.blogspot.com. You can see more Media Rants videos at my YouTube channel. Go to YouTube and search Tony Palmeri's Media Rants. You can go to my website for more information about me and my writings at www.tonypalmeri.com. And I also write a column called State of the State for the Oshkosh Independent, and you can see the URL address to get to that column. So once again, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again. Take care.